Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. With the election of a President Trump, who is a climate change denier, we are left wondering what will happen to the Paris Climate Change Agreement and its effort to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. The UN COP22 Climate Change Summit continues this week in Marrakesh with the representatives from 195 countries in attendance. For them, the prospect of a Trump presidency has left many wondering, will he honor the global commitments made by President Obama? With us to discuss this and much more is Janet Redman. Janet is the U.S. Policy Director at Oil Change International, and she's the former Director of Climate Policy Program at the Institute for Policy Studies. Janet, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So, Janet, let me first get your reaction to Donald Trump presidency, and particularly given what he has said specifically in the campaign. But before you do that, I have a small clip of him speaking to a group of workers in the sector, in the mining sector. Let's have a look.
We're going to put the miners back to work. We're going to put the miners back to work. We're going to get those mines opened. Coal country.
So, Janet, are we going to be able to put the miners back to work?
I think what we have here is another problem of Trump making promises he can't actually fulfill. We've seen that across the board in Trump's campaign. So with the Trump presidency, as we know, as you mentioned, Trump believes that climate change is a hoax invented by China. He's a vehement supporter of the fossil fuel industry. We've heard him talk about coal and coal country, but he's also, of course, talked about bringing natural gas and oil to supremacy in the United States. It's interesting, of course, that under Obama, we are the largest oil producer on earth at this point. So it's not that the U.S. has forgotten about oil in any way, shape, or form. But we see fossil fuel infrastructure and fossil fuel build out at the center of Trump's economic development plan. And we see a real subversion of climate change. I think what's really interesting right now is to look both at his statements about COP21, about the Paris Agreement, but also to look at his energy policy here at home and look at how some of what he's promised is actually in conflict with itself.
Right. This is a good time, Janet, to take a look at some of the advisors around President Trump and who he's considering. In fact, we have a clip from one of the people he's considering. His name is Myron Ebell. Let's have a look at what he's had to say in the past on this issue.
Science has settled global warming is not a crisis.
Carbon dioxide is not a pollutant.
We haven't had any temperature increase.
I would like to have more funding so that I could combat the nonsense put out by the environmental movement.
I hope whoever is elected president in 2017, of whatever party, will undo the EPA power plant regs.
So we have a climate skeptic, Myron Ebell, as the possible head of the EPA. What do you make of that?
Well, as you can imagine, I think it's a pretty problematic choice. So we're looking at Myron Ebell as head of the EPA. He's an avowed and very proud, I would say, climate denier. We also are looking at Harold Hamm as a potential head of the Department of Energy. He, of course, is a natural gas fracking mogul. And we're looking at someone named Forrest Lucas as the head of the Department of Interior. He is an oil executive. So what we're seeing is a real shift toward the fossil fuel industry. I think it's really interesting for us to look at how Donald Trump was anti-establishment in his rhetoric. He was talking about moving away from Wall Street capture, the same old elites, but those are the very people he's putting in charge of our public resources. So maybe just to talk briefly and tie this back to Marrakesh, as we know, Donald Trump has promised in his first 100-day plan he's going to cancel the Paris Agreement immediately. That's a threat that I think many at one point kind of laughed at, but we should probably take seriously. He's got a couple of options to do that. He would be able to, of course, in 4 years, when the 2020 review of the Paris Agreement comes up, he could say he is leaving that. He could make those signals now. He could also, which I think would be much more dangerous, submit a resignation from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The U.S. would leave that convention. It's unclear right now. People are still discussing in the circles that I'm listening to whether that would take an act of Congress. Senate would have to ratify leaving a convention, but that's certainly one route. But I think, as you pointed out, and as one of the clips you played by Myron Ebel pointed out, what's much more dangerous is he could just not do the things that President Obama promised on the U.S.'s behalf to do to reduce emissions. And key among those is moving the Clean Power Plan forward. The Clean Power Plan right now is caught up in the courts, as you've talked about on this show before. And with the potential appointment of a Republican and a very conservative Republican Supreme Court justice, we may in fact see the Clean Power Plan struck down at the federal level.
And let's take a look at what's actually happening in Marrakesh as we speak. Is there, 190 some countries coming together. Isn't there going to be some pressure brought on the Trump presidency to make sure that they honor the agreement?
I think that's the hope. Certainly what I'm hearing from colleagues who are on the ground right now is that I think many countries are in a bit of a state of shock. Many elected officials, many bureaucrats from other countries, experts that work on climate in other countries, I think are just as surprised as many of us in the United States are that Donald Trump was elected to the presidency, and so are recalculating what their moves are there. I think it's also important, though, to note that we have seen a situation not unlike this before. When the Kyoto Protocol was up for ratification, the U.S. decided not to join. So there is precedent, of course, for the global community to go forward without the United States in taking climate action. It would clearly be much more effective for the United States to be part of that climate action. But I think that's part of our responsibility here at home. The interesting thing about the Paris Agreement is that there's no necessity for every country to take the same kind of action. It was, of course, depending on everyone taking action. But if in the U.S. we need to do a lot of organizing at the state and local level to start taking action and build forward for 4 years from now, so we're taking federal action again, that doesn't mean that other countries can't act. Certainly, it's more tenuous now that the balance of power is that, of course, we as the second largest emitter would be right on par with, say, China, who's taking action as the world's largest emitter. But I think it doesn't preclude other countries from moving forward. I think we will see pressure, I would imagine, behind the scenes, perhaps not yet, but moving forward to ask to use other kinds of tools to help the United States reconsider the idea of tanking global efforts to keep climate chaos in check.
And if the U.S. actually sets precedent by withdrawing from the agreement, will it then empower other countries to do the same?
I'm not sure. I would not want to forecast that necessarily. I think, again, looking back at the Kyoto Protocol, we have some precedent that the global community has gone forward without us. I think I'm hopeful that there are some strategic fights that we can do here in the United States. There are some state-level wins that were surprising and were uplifting. For example, Monterey, California, upheld a natural gas fracking ban. That's actually in oil country in California. We saw rules for supporting decentralized solar wind in Florida, which, of course, was a conservative stronghold, not a surprise in Florida. So I think I'm hoping that the global community will pause for a moment and let us sort out a bit internally in the United States how we are taking action, both at the policy level, but also at the movement level, thinking about how we look at examples like Keystone, like Dakota Access, and think about how activists, I think, who have really made the call to step up their civil disobedience around fossil fuel infrastructure, what we can accomplish that way as well as Americans.
All right, Janet, I thank you so much for joining us on The Real News, and we look forward to ongoing reports of what's happening in Marrakesh. Thanks.
Thanks very much for having me on.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News Network.